Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you all for coming out tonight in the cold. I'm sorry about that. You hear me? No? Can I be a little louder? Is that better? Okay. We need to be a little loud. My name is Kiran Desai. I'm a librarian here at the Ferguson Library. I'd like to thank Elm Street Books first for coming and selling books. You can have them signed after the talk right over here at this table. We are thrilled to welcome two special guests tonight. Cressida Leyshon, she's here. She is the deputy fiction editor at the New Yorker magazine. She'll be in conversation with Kiran Desai. Kiran's book, The Inheritance of Loss, won the 2006 Man Booker Prize. And now, almost 20 years later, her newest book, The Loneliness of Sonia and Sonny, was shortlisted for the same prize. It was also named one of the New York Times Book Review's 10 Best Books of the Year, People's Top 5 Books of the Year, a Kirkus Prize finalist, and Best Book of the Year at more than 15 publications nationally, called by many a masterpiece. We're thrilled to have them both here. Please join me in welcoming Cressida Leyshon and Kiran Desai.
Oh, hi everyone. Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. Yes, I'm delighted to be here with Kiran in Stamford, Connecticut. I think we were both discussing the fact it's the first time we've been to Stamford. So this is exciting for us to be here.
It really is, despite the cold. Thank you all for coming out.
So, Kiran, I wanted to start off just by asking you a very general question. As in the introduction, we learned it's like 20 years between the publication of your last novel and this novel. Were you working on The Loneliness of Sonia and Sonny all that time?
Disgracefully, yes. I was, but not as simply as just working on this book. I was not thinking about a novel exactly. I was creating material, and I thought I would use it for a novel or two or three or four. And I was also very much, over the years, I think completely joined my real life and my writing life, my artistic life and my life were the same thing for many years. So when COVID happened, it wasn't so different for me. My life was pretty much the same. It's better. It's a bit louder now. So I was also thinking of writing as a kind of, as a sort of spiritual discipline. I would get up in the morning and go to my desk and stay there as long as I could, take a little break, go back to my desk in the evening, maybe take a night or two off to see friends occasionally. But I was living in a very solitary way and working. And I have to say, Cressida, it felt like heaven. When I look back at these years, I didn't notice the years passing.
Wow, so you were really you were writing 7 days a week, pretty much.
Yes. Well, I always work 7 days a week. And I don't have family and kids, so I can write this way. And I think it's an enormous privilege to be able to work in this way for an artist. And I was working and writing, and then I think I've said this in many interviews. I repeat it at one point. I was at a writer's residency, and I had never numbered the pages. I would write longhand and have all these diaries and boxes of them, pages and notebooks. And then I transcribe them into a computer and do more editing work, but I didn't number the pages. And then I printed them out and they came to a stack like this. There were about 5,000 pages. Yeah.
And so in the title is The Loneliness of Sonia and Sonny, and it follows these two characters, Sonia and Sonny, who the novel opens when both of them have moved from India to the United States. And Sonia is a student in Vermont. Sonny is working as a journalist for the AP in New York. And so when you were writing your 5,000 pages, did Sonia come earlier than Sonny? Did Sonny come first, or did they both kind of emerge and did you know the parts that they would play in this narrative?
No, I don't think I did. I'm trying to go back to I was thinking of eventually reading my 5,000 pages. There were so many characters, so many more characters, and so many other landscapes and other stories. And I think I realized that I could write a book about loneliness and global loneliness seen through a long, unresolved love story. So, but both Sunny and Sonia actually, they're two parts of the same bird in a way. And I was thinking of a writer I loved so much, loved for so long, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who said fiction and journalism are two wings of the same bird. And both Sonia and Sunny are out in the big world trying to locate their own story, sort of navigating a world without a center and over many landscapes. So, but I think that I probably wrote the Sonia bits first because they are very close to me. And when I arrived in the United States, I was 16. My mother was teaching at various colleges. And I went to, and I myself did my undergraduate years, spent my undergraduate years in Vermont and in very artsy fartsy Bennington College, which has produced many authors. And it was my first experience of loneliness, of painful loneliness, because the big difference between life in South Asia and life in the United States, especially in places like Vermont, is just the fact that you're physically alone for the first time. I mean, there are all kinds of lonelinesses, of course, and there are plenty. You can be very lonely in a big crowded landscape as well. But it was the first time I was actually physically alone, and it was startling because there are people in the world who don't, have never eaten a meal alone, have never been to a movie alone, have never slept in a room alone. So it was my first experience of that, but also of exquisite artistic loneliness, of being alone in the library during winter breaks and summer breaks where I always worked. And it was the time when libraries were switching from Dewey Decimal System to the Library of Congress. And I remember I was hired to do that, although the librarians once, this is true also through my graduate studies as well, one of the librarians once timed all the employees, and I was their slowest employee. But yes, so it was exquisite artistic loneliness, by which I mean I started writing my first stories. I first began to write in Vermont during that time.
And did you know before you went to Bennington that you wanted to be a writer? I mean, your mother's a writer. Did you think, no, that's the last thing I want to do, or was it always what you wanted to do?
I studied ecology, and I realized somewhere along those years, maybe year one or two, quite early on, that I was really not made for science because I was writing these papers that were more fiction than science. I remember one was called Cannibalism in the Common House Cricket. And so, I mean, and was also counting wasps and bees, I remember, the aster patches. I was really not made to be a scientist. And I took a writing class with an essayist by the name of Philip Lopate. That rings a bell. And he was wonderful. And I think other people who taught me were James Laston, and who was the man who wrote City of No Destination? Peter Cameron. Maybe I got the title wrong, but I had wonderful professors.
And did you in the novel, Sonia, in her loneliness, when she's at the fictional college she's at in Vermont, a kind of strange, eccentric, kind of charismatic artist takes up with her, and she's very vulnerable, I suppose, to anyone who seems kind of interested in her in that time. And he he becomes like a very significant figure in the novel. When he first appears in the pages of the book, did you, I mean, of the pages for Sonia, did you know that?
Did I know that
What
how important
role?
he would be, what
Yeah.
role he would play? Um, yes. I He was always a kind of um, sinister figure. I mean, I guess I knew what kind of role he played, but I didn't know what exactly he would mean in the context of the story, in that he is um, an older artist who is who gives her story basically that she does not want. So as a young part of this book is, as I've said, is a portrait of an artist as a young portrait of as a young woman, portrait of artist as a young woman. And Sonia is, and what happens when you are given so early on a subject that you do not want, and that's an obstacle to your own creative path, because she finds it it's a redundant story, this older artist, younger woman, and she feels it's been told so many times, and yet she falls into it because he's a charismatic figure, and he meets her at this time when she is very lonely, and he's lonely too, by the way. So it's there is a reason they are together for a span of time, but he also captures her within his artistic eye, and also very much directs her in her own creative journey. Like, he'll say things like, don't be Orientalist, don't write about arranged marriages, um, don't do this, don't do that. What else does he say to her?
But as a, I mean, the great kind of not humor, but irony of the novel is, of course, that as a novelist, you make the arranged marriage the subject of the novel, like brilliantly so. And so the novel itself kind of like turns his, and it kicks his advice into the dust.
Well, he's very, and Sonia too, as I am, is very conscious of what it means to write an Indian story out in the big world. And Elan, this sinister artist, does tell Sonia, what the British did to you is what you're doing to yourself, which is exoticizing your own story. And I felt that very much because when I wrote my first novel, I was so young. I was in my 20s, and it's called Hullabaloo and the Guava Orchard. And never would I ever call a novel, I never give a novel of mine a title like that ever again. I'm kind of embarrassed about the title. Um, but, and I remember listening to a lovely conversation between the writer Salman Rushdie and the writer Marlon James. And Marlon said something like, "Do you have any advice?" And he said, tropical fruit, don't put that in your title. That's And yet, you have to ask the question also, exotic to whom, right? Exotic to whom? It's quite normal to eat a guava in India. In fact, it's more normal than to eat an apple in a way, because apples come from the mountains. Um, so how do you write a book without also wondering whether you are selling an audience, a white audience, a bigger audience, something they just want to gobble up about India, and that another authentic story is not coming through, that it is a sort of cheap bazaar of books out there. And so Sonia is very conscious of this. And she's also thinking that there are a lot of course, most marriages in India are still arranged. And in a family like mine, there would be all kinds of marriages that are not arranged, marriages that are. There would be people who've separated, who've been divorced, a whole plethora of experiences. So I thought it would be most accurate to include all of these different experiences, which is also why, I mean, the book became so big. I felt as if I couldn't say, if I said this, then, but that would also be true. Something contradictory would also be true. And so I was constantly having to include more and more stories.
And so with Sonny, he is the grandparents kind of decide that this should be a good arranged marriage between Sonia and Sonny,
Yes.
much as each of the characters kind of loathes this notion. And kind of apart for many, many, many pages of the novel and in their lives, and then they intersect and they part again, and they intersect and they part. But there is a sense in which their lives may have been very simple if they'd gone ahead
Yes.
with this plan and not unhappy.
Yes. In fact, it's almost as if the globalized world makes things so complicated, and they would have been matched in a very simple way had it not been for the fact that they live out in this complex world where the idea of self is growing ever more fluid. They're sort of seeking belonging and seeking home at the same time. They are not sure of who they are, and they travel from India to Europe to Italy to New York to Mexico, all these different landscapes. Um, so, but you're right. I was thinking that had at the time of my grandparents and even my parents, love story would be centered in one community, one class, one religion, most likely one place, one race, and now it's so much a matter of chance who you might meet, when and where. And yet, as you said, Sunny and Sonia are matched by their grandparents, who are neighbors in this provincial town. And then they think of themselves as cosmopolitan citizens of the world and poo-poo this idea. And then they meet on the overnight train to Allahabad, which was a train I often took to my grandparents' home. And, I was thinking of how the past is a kind of home to us. And so they are traveling back into the past. And there's a moment when they finally meet, which is over 200 pages into the book. And they're sitting side by side on Sonia's grandparents' veranda. And there's a feeling of just being weighted very deeply, as if they're actually an old couple sitting on the veranda where all arguments and all decisions have all long ago passed under the bridge. And and they have that emotion and that sudden feeling of being cradled by history in a way.
Then in a slightly heartbreaking way, they part again,
Yes.
and it's going to be another long journey for them to come back together. Did you find that parting hard, or were you kind of like, yep, time to go off?
I thought it was honest, that they would part and then go through other life experiences, separate from each other, and yet be drawn back. I constantly felt both the fragility of the relationship and yet also its power, both those things. And what happens to Sunny and Sonia? They both are sort of claimed by a kind of undercurrent of darkness. And that was interesting to me also to include in this book. Sonia personally, but also, and Sunny too. I mean, both of them are Sonia through this awful encounter she's had with this older artist, but also perhaps negotiating life as a young woman in India and sort of seeing experiencing both the promise and failure of feminism. And I began to structure, and Sunny, of course, is also claimed by family darkness of corruption, but they're also thinking about political darkness in India and in the United States. And the unseen world is very important in this book, this sort of dread that there is a strain of violence and nobody knows when it's going to come bursting into view and who it's going to ensnare. And so I was working with that sense of an undercurrent, and also with all the divides between us. So I realized when I set a love story out into this big world, I could not think not only about romantic loneliness, but also about loneliness as the divides of race and class and nations and all of these enormous power divides we encounter.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it is in many ways a very political novel. both when it thinks about the US and the place of immigrants in the country, and also very much about India. And how have you found the response in both those countries when it comes to the more political aspects of the book?
I'm pleasantly surprised because I have to say that I thought I would be. The book is quite critical about American politics and it's quite critical about Indian politics. But yet I've had like a lovely response from readers. So maybe we all feel the same way. But it was it really helped me to structure the book in these different ways. And a lot of it is also about who is captured by whose gaze when it comes to journalism, when it comes to love, when it comes to nations. All of these different things. So when you said you're talking about why Sunny and Sonia are why they are parted, because they are naturally parted by all of these divides.
And how, in terms of like, Sunny has a very close friend, Satya, who is also kind of always in the process of getting married and does marry and marries the right person in terms of his caste and his background and who he should, but is unhappy within that marriage in a way. But do you? So, and I mean, Satya becomes a much more. I suppose he's kind of like a more BJP kind of supporter. No,
Yeah.
no, or not at all.
No.
No, he would never be that. But I mean, he's more conventional.
He's not political. He's not a political animal. No, he says, I think at one time, Sunny observes of him. He's not concerned. I mean, Sunny says of him, he's a doctor. And Sunny thinks of his friend. He thinks how lucky he is. And he thinks he does not need journalism and he does not need art because he has real life. And so he's really negotiating, living a good life, decent life. But his immigrant journey is much more simple because he has just arrived in the United States to do better, to make a good life. It is Sunny who's more complex in his thinking because he comes from a very westernized and well-off family.
Yeah,
And
I suppose it's that. I guess I see Satya as conservative with a small c, and then I sent him. I misjudged his goals.
But it was interesting to me to write about politics and how the politics of India is transported to. This is something I'm actually curious to work on in the future as well. How it is transported to the diaspora here and how it begins to influence the politics in the United States, but also sometimes about how the journey goes the other way, about how what's happening in the diaspora here, which can be very conservative, is transported back to India. But also the United States politics. I mean, there's a little bit about a 9/11, and which Sunny observes from Mexico. And I found what has been interesting in my own immigrant and writing journey was that I always thought it would be India, United States, India, and that conversation would be always the center of my work. But what surprised me was the door opened to another continent, and Mexico entered my life and has been a wonderful part of my writing journey. And it was so extraordinary to me to go there for the first time. And I thought, oh, you really don't know what the United States is all about as an immigrant until perhaps you go to Mexico and see it from Latin America, because India is always Britain oriented. Only now is it more linked to the United States than it used to be.
And how did that door to Mexico open for you?
In such a nice way, Cressida. Thank you for asking that that question. My mom was teaching in Boston, and one winter it was so snowy, and she remembers being traumatized. She said the snowbanks were so high. And she read an article in the New York Times about how wonderful was Oaxaca. And so she took a flight and stepped off the plane and thought it was, a revelation, a new civilization. And yet many things that were similar to India too. And then we went together the following year because I had a professor who had a village house in a village called Teputslan, where you were really woken by roosters in the morning. And it was right near the town. The man who transported junk, not really garbage, but he sorted junk. And so in the morning you would hear, there'd be music in the yard and chickens and the garbage heaps were being between tin cans and paper, everything was being sorted out. And we would sit outside on the veranda, and I remember the happiness of reading and writing on that veranda. And it was the first of many years of going on writing holidays with my mother to Mexico. And she's written about Mexico too. She wrote a book last year called Rosarita, which was set in Mexico.
And how did Mexico did it allow you to see India in a different way, or did it allow you to understand things that you hadn't thought about?
It was lovely because in a way I think it, holds a mirror up to the United States, but I didn't expect it would somehow hold a mirror up to India as well. And I just thought a lot about the different colonial influences of Britain, India, Spain, Mexico. Although, as one of the characters remarked, what was wrong with the Spanish? They left Mexico so much sooner. The British stuck on much, much longer in India. But they also took these similarities, and I think a lot of artists have tried to really make connections in a more historical way and failed. One of those people being the poet Octavio Paz, who apparently was quite a dandy and a little bit of a snob, and he was a diplomat and hoped to be sent to Paris, but he was sent to India. And at first he was alarmed, and then it changed his life. He wrote some extraordinary books set in India and some extraordinary poems. But he wrote a book called In Light of, that's how it was translated, In Light of India. And he tried it really hard to make connections and things like, and he came up with this idea of mole and curry being the same, and of a princess from Rajasthan being kidnapped by pirates and transported to Mexico. But I think it's really not like that. There are other undercurrents, and perhaps the connection is apparent really in an artist's eye. I think of Cartier-Bresson's photographs or things like that. It's more subtle.
And when you went to in a piece in The Guardian, you talked about when you first went to Britain, when you left India, it clearly, I'm not sure it had cast the same spell on you as Mexico. What was it like to just go, like you'd probably grown up in a kind of quite British inflected education system, to actually then arrive in the country and go to school?
Yes, I grew up with bookshelves that were full of English children's books and quite obscure ones that I don't know where my mother found them, like Scratchkin Patchkin, who lived like a leaf in the apple tree. I don't know if did you grow up with that, Cressida? And Mrs. Apple and her Pekingese dogs. Did you grow up with those? I don't know. There must be a whole. But we had all of these wonderful books, like Millie, Molly, Mandy. Yeah. And of course, things like Wind in the Willows and Paddington Bear. So those books, and my mother's English publishers coming to India to see her. And I went to Loreto Convent, so therefore I was taught by Irish nuns. We were taught the Highland Fling. We had to wear kilts, and we had tam o' shanters on our heads. So yeah, it's so quite extraordinary. And then going to England just for a year, I was there on our way to the United States. I found it incredibly difficult. I'd never left India before. And the place of India in the scheme of things and in the world, it shocked me. Talking of Sonia and Sonia, having to encounter these power divides, I think the power divide is so great. You can't help as a child, especially as a teenager. I was 16. You can't help but feel, I think, that the location of your dignity is in a smaller place than you ever imagined. and it was difficult. And I've heard other authors talking about this. I've heard Salman Rushdie, again, I mentioned it before, speaking of what it was like to go to boarding school. And also, you're encountering racism for the first time. It's not something I was prepared for. And I was like, oh, well, this is what it's all about. Walking by a pub at closing time, I was quite surprised at what words were thrown out at me as a child. But also, Naipaul became important and an important influence to me, hugely important. Perhaps first book, and even Halabaloo and the Guava Orchard, because of his first books, Mystic Monsieur and those early books he wrote in Trinidad. And then with Inheritance of Loss, I was definitely thinking and learning from House for Mr. Biswas and Bend in the River. And with this book, Enigma of Arrival was important.
And do you think when you came to America, did that, I mean, it's like, I guess it's kind of a process of triangulation. Like you have India, the UK, America, you have America, India, and Mexico. And without the third country in place, does that kind of transform? It transforms all understanding.
It does. And I always think that, it's so important perhaps for countries to not go through that colonial or that imperial power, and for artists not to take that, go through that journey, because even when you're taking flights, you often have to go to this hub and then you go to the third country. And it's so wonderful when you have, say, someone from Mexico, Octavio Paz, writing about India, or an Indian writing about Guyana, or traveling directly from one non-Western country to another. But it is true that it was an enormous relief to break that binary way of thinking, and not to think India, Britain, and to include the United States, a completely different history, to step sideways. And then again with Mexico, and I deeply appreciate the work of someone like Jhumpa Lahiri, who went to Italy, and I can understand why she did that.
And if you had to choose, if you got to go to any country now, which country would it be that you added fourth destination?
I don't know. Sunny, because Sunny is a journalist, at one point I had him traveling much more than he does in this book. And everyone told me, Kiran, it's too much. These my poor editors. But I had him traveling to other countries as well. Although, I whittled it down to Mexico because I knew Mexico best. Although I'm still writing about Mexico from an outsider's point of view, I still had been there for so many years, going every year to work. I don't know. I don't know, Cressida, if I would include another thing. I feel like this, I almost feel as if going to Mexico could be a lifetime's work. And also not losing India, which is very important to me. And I thought again that I would be, grow apart from India after so many years of living in the States. And I think it's because I feel I'm losing that childhood India, or that India's changing drastically as a country, that I veered back.
I mean, do you feel any sense of nostalgia in the scenes that you do write that are set in India about these big eccentric kind of family situations?
Nostalgia is such a dirty word in literature. But so, I was very conscious of trying to include the warts and all the bad things and the difficult things as well. And yet, I'm very conscious of being incredibly grateful for having grown up in the India I grew up in. Because again, as I said, it is changing politically. And I feel that something very precious is being lost, is in danger of being lost, which is this unbelievable ability and diversity of landscape, where you could write with, so much affection and knowledge of people very different from yourself.
And I think we have time for some audience questions if anyone has any questions. And while that's happening, um, I think there's a microphone actually. It's coming around.
Is it on?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to say that we have to wait for the microphone to come so that everyone can hear.
Is this on? Hi, Kiran. I'm Mexican, so I'm glad you like my country. It's not a question. I just wanted to recommend that you look up Oscar Lewis. He's an anthropologist, and he did a study between various cultures and countries. And in his studies, he discovered that both Mexico and India were very similar as far as culture, religion, roles that men and women play, the different social structures. And I'm married to an Indian and
Wow.
into India.
How lovely. Did you say Oscar Lewis?
Yes.
Yes.
Oscar Lewis.
Yeah.
And when I went to India, I had this similar experience, but in the opposite direction.
How funny. I had a lovely time writing a conversation between Satya, who Cressida mentioned, and someone on a Mexican bus. And they're both traveling in Mexico, and Satya's trying to find his friend Sunny. And it was so much fun writing that passage that, you are family, big family people, we are big family people.
Yeah.
You are women with long black hair, we are women with long black hair. You have tamarind, we have tamarind. You have rice, we have rice. You have mole, we have curry. You had when the British were living we both had gold and astronomy when the Spanish and the British were living in dirt. And you were cursed by the Spanish, we were cursed by the British. And then they end by saying, but who has the hottest chili?
And on a personal note, I actually do have a question. My
Yes.
husband calls his family, they call themselves Anglo-Indians because they're of mixed culture. They're not real, well, I don't even know how to explain it, but they have different roots, like a Scottish mother and
Yes.
I don't know, they seem to have struggled a lot, especially here in America. I think it was worse in India, and that's what motivated them to migrate here. I don't know if you had, I'm sure you have some of it in your books, but I don't know if you personally have experienced things like that too.
You said it was the complicated background because of being Anglo-Indian or a mixed family.
Yeah,
And
and
there are a
lots
lot
of
of-
marriages were like arranged cousins.
Oh, I see. Oh, I see. Well, that's that's interesting. But yes, certainly I have it in my own family because my mother is half German, in fact. So I think that's why I inherited her bookshelves, and she always says that she was given because of her parents. She had both a European eye and an Indian one, and I think I was very lucky to inherit that bookshelf.
Oh, does anyone else?
My question isn't that deep. So you whittled it down from 5,000 pages to how many?
So from 5,000, my editor reminds me now that he saw it when it was 1,400 pages. And then from 1,400, it became, I think, 800, 900, 1,000, and then now it's 700.
Yeah,
But it's actually not that big in the scheme of things. I mean,
calculate the time for our book.
think of Dickens. I mean, I did a lot of Googling about how long other books were, and it seems that
It's
from Dickens to Hilary Mantel, I've been beaten quite a lot.
670.
600.
Forward to reading it.
Thank you so much. It goes quickly because it is a love story.
Now we have to see how much time to allocate.
Yes.
But thank you. I'm
Winter,
really looking
cold
forward
winter
to it.
nights. Thank you so much.
Oh, I think over on this side. Oh, all over the place.
It came right up to me. So we read this book in our book club, and we really liked the. I know you said you don't have children, but the relationship between Sonny and his mother, and Sonia and her father and her mother, and we're all mothers here in this book club, but we're vastly political, different perspectives. So, wanted to know just a recommendation. What should we read next?
Oh, my goodness.
If we really like to read books about family relationships and learning more about other cultures and but being open to different
Really?
political views.
Cressida has a recommendation.
It's actually one of Karan's recommendations, which is A House for Mr. Biswas.
I love A House for Mr. Biswas, and it's very tender because I always remember, because it's based on his own father and his search to build a home in Trinidad. And I always remember the father in the heat of Trinidad making up the sign for his shop, and he's singing in the snowy and the blowy and in the heat of Trinidad. And always reminds me of being in India and reading Wuthering Heights and, thinking of the wild heat. That's a lovely book. And also the book that I just read, and it really made me miss my stop on the subway the other day, was Katie Kitamura's Audition. And if you are mothers and parents, I think that's a fantastic book about mothers and of being a mother and of also being an artist and a mother. That was fascinating to me.
Here at the back.
Hello, my name is Ruchi Sharma. So nice to see you and hear you speak today. I just wanted to tell you how much I appreciate hearing about your past. My mother is from Delhi, and she was the first one from her family to leave. Her and my dad had immigrated to Montreal, Canada. And so I was born in Montreal, grew up in Canada, and then I moved to the United States just as I was finishing high school, actually Texas, not quite Mexico. And so at this point, I've spent half my life in Canada and half my life in the United States. I'm curious between your experience in, Great Britain and then United States, what your perspective was. Because when I speak to my friends who are first generation Indians, I tell them it's quite different between the two countries, even though we're neighboring countries between Canada and the US. I have family in Australia too, and it's also been very different talking to cousins who have grown up there. And so I'm curious to hear about your perspective from that.
So interesting, isn't it? I think that there's so many of us for whom we are always traversing borders, and borders that in a way makes no sense for moving people. There's so many, it just make no sense. And yet, of course, they define absolutely everything. And so many of us are also traveling, are carrying so many different landscapes at the very same time, that we're here, but that we're also at the, in this room, but somewhere you're also thinking about a relative who's in Australia or in India and what's going on with them. And, when I was in Mexico, I had one writer friend when I was during COVID times. I was working there for a long stretch. And that was the wonderful author, Sandra Cisneros, who I'm sure many of you have read. And she was helping me explain my book. And she said, we are all these global orphans wandering around the world, and our faces are in one country and our feet are in another country. And that, I think, is a nice way to think about it. But maybe your question was something different about how being in these different countries, you of course do develop differently and think differently and have, it's true, you do. And then your families come together. And what can I say? They get together for a big fat Indian wedding or a funeral. And then it's a wonderful subject for a novelist.
Do we have any
Thinking
more?
of, monsoon wedding.
I think we have
by
some
the mother of Zohran Mamdani.
We've got some in the front as well. Oh, I think you have to wait for the microphone to arrive. Thank you.
I was wondering if your latest book was autobiographical.
You mean this one, Sonia
This
and
one,
Sunny?
yes. And I have another question. It's not a question. I just wanted to say I love the humor in the book. I mean, it is so funny. And every time you repeat the line and say, but what solace is that? But what
Thank
solace
you.
is that?
Thank you for reading it so much.
And then, and it's very picaresque. So the way they talk in India, like they'll say Vinny Puni. So, those little sentences are very funny. I don't know if it's funny for a different audience who has not experienced that.
Thank you. In terms of being autobiographical, yes and no. Like any author, I think that there are elements that are very close to my life, elements that are not at all, that are completely imagined, and others that are completely imagined, and yet I feel like I've known those people. Babita, for example, Sunny's mother, just completely imagined, and yet I feel I've known so many Babitas in my life. But certainly, I was drawing on my experiences in New York and in Vermont, and yeah, in different places. I was careful to set this book only in places that I'd been to and that I knew. And also, as I was just telling Cressida, that grandparents' veranda has always been important to me in all my work.
And do we have how much more time do we have for questions?
Another 5 minutes.
Okay, so another 5 minutes. I think over here in the green shirt.
Thank you. Loved the book. Magical. That's all I will say. But I just wanted to ask you a simple question. Between the two characters, Sunny and Sonia, who do you feel you took more care of? Who were you more like drawn to? Did you have a favorite? Because everybody has a favorite.
I feel as if they're two sides of the same person coming together in the end, that they're actually the same person in a way. But maybe you feel differently. Somebody else asked me, a journalist said, you with Sonia's family, there's Mama, Papa, and with Sunny, there's Babita. So it's almost as if, and he said, you think you centered it with Sonia more in mind than Sunny. So perhaps I did, although, I don't know, Sunny also seems very dear to me. Yeah, I would almost ask you that question, in fact. It was what the hardest thing was for me was that they were both writers of a different kind, but there are a lot of artists in the book and a lot of writers in this book and so that was actually a bit of a challenge when I was writing it.
And now I think yes, over here.
Oh, sorry. I'm about 65% of the way through. I was hoping to finish it before I came tonight, but I didn't. But one of the parts that I particularly liked, I like all of it so far, but there was a section where he ultimately wrote an essay for the Penn Essay Contest. But before he decided to write the essay, he just goes through these several pages of, well, do I know enough about being American to write in an American newspaper, or should I go and write in India for an American newspaper, but maybe I don't know enough about India. And then he goes through this circular thing about the world being upside down, and because he's not really either of them. And anyway, it was kind of, in my mind, a little meta, because I knew that you also were born in India and were writing here, and you're writing this character who's struggling with these same issues. And you talked a little bit about it in the beginning, but to me, I thought that I keep seeing those themes as I'm reading through the book.
Yes, thank you for that. That is definitely something that both Sunny and Sonia, talking of Sonia's wondering about how to write an Indian novel, and Sunny anxious about not really having, about how to report in a landscape when you don't really belong to it. And it was very interesting to me to think about immigrants in general arriving in the United States and really, coming up against, for example, the whole conversation about race when you don't understand it, and the feeling of joining in that vocabulary, and at the same time feeling you're transgressing upon it because you really don't know it, especially as a journalist or a young reporter. And it being so complex, and then at the same time also meeting people from all over the world and realizing that all these different people and arriving suddenly and
having to join the conversation, also having to join it because all of a sudden you are part of it. You're a person of color. And so how, which is something you never think of in your own country. You don't think of yourself as a person of color. And in India, you would be thinking of caste and class. You wouldn't be thinking of race. So it's a whole new subject, and yet an essential one. And I think a lot of immigrants go through a whole process of understanding and accepting and trying to join it, thinking of how to, thinking perhaps they don't need to, that it's a fresh new country and just don't learn the history, and then realizing it exerts itself, in every sphere. And then also realizing that every community of color also has their own incredible hierarchy of race, which is so complex and so weird that, you suddenly think like, oh, who's up and who's down, and they're all carefully calibrated, and in terms of class, in terms of color, and in Mexico it's one thing, in India it's one thing, in Korea it's one thing, in Japan it's one thing, and everybody is placed in different categories. So bizarre and completely taboo. And again, I think the place for a novel, because you can really talk about what people are actually thinking about race and class, and they don't say it.
I think, okay, if we just do one more question, and then we'll be just here on the front row, and that will be our last question.
Thank you. I actually have quite a personal question, if it's okay. So I know you have quite a close relationship with your mother. So I wonder if you thought having a partner or having kids would be detrimental to your artistic career at all. Because to be honest, I just debuted last year as a novelist myself, and I have a 3-year-old and now a newborn, and I don't have as much time to write, but I would love to hear.
I don't think it's hard for me to even know, because I don't think in that way. I just got up and went to my desk, and I got up and went to my desk. And, I was reading the architect Zaha Hadid was asked this question, and she responded in the same way. She said, I did my work and life passed me by, which is telling, because I do know, of course, there are plenty of women who would pause and say, no, I want to have children. And I didn't. So, that's just how I was. But it is interesting to me when I think of my mother, who has 4 children. I'm one of 4. And she says that actually she found motherhood was helped her, right? And I can see that sometimes I cannot write about that subject, and she could. So I am aware of it, gave her that subject, but also she, in terms of writing time, she said it became so important. She carved out those hours, and she actually wrote more and with more energy when she was a young mother than she did, she said, when she was all alone and as a retired professor and alone in our big house.
Oh, wow. So on that, I'd like to say thank you to Kiran for being so wonderful.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Cressida.
Thanks to everyone for all your great questions too.
And to the library. Isn't it fantastic to be in a library doing this?
To be in a library in Stamford.
In Stamford.
And I think that Kiran,
where we should go to dinner before we go home.
But you're going to go and sign some books over there. She'll be signing books, selling books. Okay, thank you.